You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Can I give you a real incentive to lean into your decision to start working out and eating better? I'm Carl, co-founder of Body. That's BODI. And right now, if you sign up for a 1-year subscription to Body, I want to make you an offer you can't refuse. I'll give you 65% off. Look, I know it's not easy to get fit and lose weight, especially if you're trying to figure it out by yourself, but we make it simple. Just follow a program for 20 to 30 minutes day by day and lose 5 to 10 pounds a month. We have over 120 programs that have been tested and proven to work, and almost 300,000 5-star reviews in the App Store to prove it. Body also has complete eating plans and thousands of healthy, delicious recipes. So stop guessing and start seeing results with Body, and I'll give you 65% off your annual membership right now, so you save big on the app that CNN_ named Best Fitness App. So don't wait. Sign up for a year of Body and save 65%. Just go to body.com. That's body with an I.com.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. Join me on my new podcast, Face Off, US versus China, where I'll take you behind the scenes in the tumultuous US-China relationship. Find Face Off wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 176, The Invasion of Norway, the End and the Beginning of Norwegian Resistance. This week a big thank you goes out to William, Micah, and Mike for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. You can find out more over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. On May 28th, the Allied forces in Norway had accomplished one of the key goals of the campaign. They had recaptured the port of Narvik from the Germans. And yet, by the time that the message was sent from Narvik that the city had been captured, the decision had already been made in London to wind down the campaign and to evacuate as many men and as much material as possible. The root of this decision was probably in a May 20th report from the Inter-Service Planning Staff to the Chiefs of Staff, a British planning body that prepared information for higher-level decision-making bodies within the British government and military. The report was written up in the shadows of the absolute disasters that were at that very moment occurring in France. The German invasion had started on May 10th, and on May 26th, the evacuations from Dunkirk were complete. This new situation caused British leaders to completely reevaluate the importance and viability of the fighting in Norway. Here's a quote from the report, quote, "Support by home-based aircraft for our land forces in Narvik area was not possible, as that area was out of range of all but the few coastal command flying boats. Bomber command aircraft were no longer available for operations over Norway when the German attack on the Low Countries began. It was clear that we could not afford to spare a single man or gun, much less one aircraft, for what was regarded as a secondary theater when the disaster upon disaster was overtaking our forces in the West." End quote. Even with the change in priorities that were already underway, and the decision to evacuate Norway in the near future, the attack on Narvik still went forward. There were a variety of justifications that were given for this action. British leaders wanted to ensure that the port facilities in Narvik were destroyed. This would prevent their use by the Germans and prevent the flow of the Swedish iron ore from Narvik, which was one of the primary reasons that all of that stuff in Norway was happening in the first place. There was also the idea that by neutralizing the German forces in Narvik, it would be easier and safer to execute the evacuation. But the French general, Bétuart, was probably closer to the truth when he wrote later that the real reason that Narvik was captured was because all of the Allies needed a victory. They needed something to go their way, because that certainly was not going to happen in France. Along with the evacuation plans, just as had occurred in central Norway, there was also an order not to tell the Norwegians what was happening. This would be very challenging for the officers who had worked so closely with the Norwegians. For example, the General Bétuart would say, quote, "I am operating with Norwegian troops, whom for reasons of national honor, I will not abandon in difficulties on the battlefield." End quote. To prevent information from reaching the Norwegians, attempts were made to keep the number of people who knew what was happening as low as possible. Those who were read into the plan were also given a list of various things to answer questions with, primarily around the idea that British and French forces were being repositioned in Norway now that Narvik had been recaptured. It was a good excuse for why units were preparing to leave, although totally dishonest. This lie was completely unsustainable, though, for the same reasons that it had been weeks earlier in central Norway. Eventually, the Norwegians would have to be told because, as the evacuation grew nearer, their help was going to be needed. But Churchill made the decision to delay letting the Norwegian leaders know until June 1st, when the first evacuations would begin on June 3rd, giving them just 2 days to determine what their path forward was in Norway. After they were informed on June 1st, the civilian government in Tromsø would summon the military leadership, General Rouge and General Fleischer, for a meeting to basically determine the future of Norway. There were 3 basic options available to the Norwegian leaders, all with their own risks and consequences. The first option was for the government to stay in the country and seek an immediate peace with Germany. It does not appear that this option was seriously considered by the Norwegian leaders. The second option was to stay in the country and continue to resist, a decision that would only result in defeat due to a lack of support from the Allies, but might allow for the Norwegian military to perhaps control part of northern Norway for at least a little bit. The third option was to take the government into exile and continue the war, but to give all of Norway and its people over to Germany during the remainder of hostilities, or at least until they could stage some kind of counter-invasion of Norway. This final option would be the one selected by the assembled Norwegian leaders, with the plan that would develop being that the government and some members of the military, including General Fleischer, would be evacuated to Britain. Meanwhile, General Rouge and the bulk of the Norwegian military would stay behind to continue to resist while the evacuations occurred, and then immediately after. However, there was the recognition that this resistance would soon end, and then General Rouge would be responsible for seeking a way to surrender the Norwegian military on the best possible terms. Rouge would be given complete authority for whatever happened in northern Norway, and would be able to make any decisions that he felt necessary, with these new responsibilities being given to him and sort of bestowed upon him on June 7th. The first set of evacuations would begin on the night of June 3rd, and as with every other such operation, it would be a challenging dance. It would take some time to get everyone out of Norway, and so it was important to try and prevent the Germans from learning what was happening. There were around 25,000 troops to be evacuated, and they would be divided into a series of different groups. To try and lessen the risk of air attack, the transports had to be dispatched to northern Norway for the purpose of evacuation, only 2 at a time and at night, with a larger sort of rendezvous being 200 kilometers offshore where the Royal Navy was a bit better able to protect them. When the transports arrived close to the shore, the men and equipment were moved to them via destroyers and then local Norwegian fishing ships. By the end of June 6th, after a couple days of evacuation, 6 transports had been loaded, representing around 15,000 troops, which would begin to make their way back to Great Britain. The final 7 transports would be loaded up over the next 2 days, before they also started on their way back to Britain. Along with the vital troop transports, there were 2 separate groups of transports that were sent and that were dedicated to evacuating supplies and equipment. After the aftermath of Dunkirk, where supplies and equipment had to have been left behind, these supplies in northern Norway gained new importance. Fortunately for the British and French, most of the supplies and equipment would successfully be evacuated, with everything being done by roughly June 9th. While the evacuations were taking place, the last major naval engagement of the Norwegian campaign would occur on June 8th. In the afternoon of the 8th, the Gneisenau and Scharnhorst were moving north through the North Sea, when a lookout on the Scharnhorst spotted smoke 45 kilometers away. The smoke was from the British carrier Glorious, one of the battle cruiser to carrier conversions that had been completed by the Royal Navy during the interwar period. When the Glorious realized what was happening, when the German ships appeared and were chasing her, the carrier was suddenly in a very challenging position. The Glorious had a hangar full of aircraft that could attack the German ships, but as with other carriers during the war, the Glorious would have to turn into the wind to begin flight operations. But turning into the wind would require the Glorious to steam directly towards the German ships. The Glorious's captain instead decided to try and run away, but it would prove to be impossible. At 5:30 p.m. at a range of over 25,000 meters, the Scharnhorst would open fire, The shells quickly found their mark and the Glorious caught fire. The two destroyers that were with the carrier also quickly came under fire, with the Ardent being hit early in the engagement. The Casta would have a bit more time, and the destroyer would be able to launch some torpedoes, two of which would hit the Scharnhorst. But it was also only a matter of time for this small British destroyer, and soon the captain gave the order to abandon ship. The action was over quite quickly, and in that time over 1,500 men of the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force were lost. Only a tiny number of survivors would be picked up over the following days, with 6 of them being rescued by the Germans and 39 more being found by a Norwegian steamer. It was a disaster of the highest order, only slightly offset by the damage done to the Scharnhorst, which would make its way back to Trondheim for emergency repairs before making its way back to Germany. The Gneisenau would be attacked by a British submarine later in the month, which would put both German ships in port until January 1941. On the same day that the Glorious would encounter the German battleships, the process of surrendering the Norwegian military to the Germans was underway. On June 7th, the final meeting was held on Norwegian soil by the Norwegian government, military leaders, and the king. The government leaders would be on a British cruiser just a few hours later. At this meeting, the final orders were given out to Norwegian forces, with all of the naval vessels, aircraft, and merchant ships that could leave for Britain being told to do so immediately. Over the preceding days, there had been plans put in place for one final Norwegian attack in the areas around Narvik, but this attack would never occur. Instead, in the late hours of June 8th, a message was sent to the German military leaders in Norway that the Norwegians were prepared to negotiate a ceasefire. Shortly after this message was sent to the Germans, orders were sent out to Norwegian forces to begin the demobilization process, with most of the troops moved out of their forward positions. The first message received back from the German general von Falkenhorst set the deadline for the end of the hostilities at 4 p.m. on June 9th, which the Norwegians successfully moved to midnight, so about 6 hours later. While the fighting would end, negotiations began for the official surrender of Norwegian forces, with General Rouge and his staff surrendering to Didel in northern Norway on June 12th. The Germans allowed the previous Norwegian orders for demobilization to continue without interruption, as men were removed from the front and either demobilized in place or sent home and then demobilized there. With the conclusion of negotiations, the invasion of Norway and the organized resistance of the Norwegian military in Norway was over by the end of June 9th, just 2 months after the first German troops had come ashore. Today's podcast is proudly sponsored by Fold 3, the web's premier collection of military records that helps bring the events of World War II history to life. Immerse yourself in over 670 million records as you explore photographs, individual service records, formerly classified military documents, and more. Learn how the greatest generation's triumphs and sacrifices impacted history as you take a front row seat to epic tales of courage, sacrifice, resilience, and valor. Have a veteran in your family? On Fold 3, you can combine records found on the site with what you have in your own albums and shoeboxes to create an online memorial for someone who served. Discover your military ancestors today at fold3.com.
Hey there! Did you know Kroger always gives you savings and rewards on top of our lower-than-low prices? And when you download the Kroger app, you'll enjoy over $500 in savings every week with digital coupons. And don't forget fuel points to help you save up to $1 per gallon at the pump. Want to save even more? With a Boost membership, you'll get double fuel points and free delivery. So shop and save big at Kroger today. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Savings may vary by state. Restrictions apply. See site for details.
From the German perspective, the operations in Norway had been a tremendous success. The German forces had been able to capture all of Norway with all the benefits provided by the long Norwegian coastline without impacting the success of the larger German operations in Western Europe that occurred later in the spring of 1940. It was also a major showcase of involving all German military arms in one operation, and they would generally work pretty well together. In their evaluations of the enemies they had faced during the fighting in Norway, the Germans were generally pretty complimentary of the average Norwegian soldier and the actions of the small Norwegian units that they often faced during the fighting. This positive evaluation was not shared with their views on the larger sort of Norwegian units and their commanders. and the Germans felt that the Norwegians had not handled the larger operations of the campaign very well, which was probably just indicative of a lack of large Norwegian training exercises during the 1930s. The French forces that the Germans faced received generally high evaluations, which were not shared at all by the British forces, which the Germans remarked had low morale, poor self-reliance, and a general lack of solid fighting qualities. That's a pretty rough statement there. The overall impacts of the Norwegian campaign would be felt for the rest of the war by the Germans and by the other nations that had participated, although not always in the most obvious ways. One of the more important but less obvious impacts of the campaign was the impact that it would have on Hitler's position in military decisions and his belief in his own military decision-making acumen. Norway was an operation that was planned by military officers, but Hitler felt that he had instigated the overall campaign, and that it just proved once again that he was a military genius. Now, it is true that Hitler had overridden some of the concerns of the German military leaders, who did not want to disperse German strength with the invasion of France, scheduled for just a month after the Norwegian operation. These concerns would prove to be unfounded, and Hitler would take that as a sign that he knew more about military matters than the German military. The impact that this had on the overall power dynamics among the military high command was similar to the impact of the Anschluss, or the remilitarization of the Rhineland, on the power dynamics in German politics. In all three instances, Hitler had gambled, taken a major risk, but it had paid off. And in doing so, it solidified his position as the person who had, better instincts than those around him. These actions were similar because they were bold actions that other nations did not expect Germany to take, and those bold strokes would pay off. This would encourage further bold strokes, but there would soon be a day when they would stop paying off. And this did not cause Hitler to reevaluate his instincts, and instead just caused him to lose even more faith in the leaders of the German military, a theme which would become very critical after the invasion of the Soviet Union, a little over a year after the end of the operations in Norway. A more obvious and immediate impact of the actions in Norway on Germany was the disastrous problems that the German Navy would face in the weeks and months that followed the operation. One of the primary reasons for the invasion had been to obtain Norwegian bases for the Kriegsmarine, a goal that had been accomplished. The problem was that there was not a lot of Kriegsmarine left to take advantage of those bases. Among its surface fleet, the Kriegsmarine had lost almost half of its strength, 1 of its 2 heavy cruisers, 2 of its 6 light cruisers, and 10 of its 20 destroyers. And many of those that were not lost outright had suffered damage that required months to fix in port. Due to the availability of resources and construction priorities, the German surface forces would pretty much never recover from the actions in Norway. Even though the most powerful German ships like the Bismarck and the Tirpitz would enter the fleet later in the war, they would enter into a fleet that was probably weaker than it was before the Norwegian operations. The U-boats also did not escape the bloodletting, with 6 U-boats being lost in operations around Norway during the invasion. The Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would also be damaged heavily in operations directly related or immediately following the invasion, which meant that for most of 1940, there would be no significant Kriegsmarine operations. Even worse, events in France would largely negate the utility of Norwegian ports altogether, as ports like Brest and Lorient and Saint-Nazaire on France's Atlantic coast were far better positioned for U-boat operations and as staging points for surface raiders. The Norwegian ports would prove to be useful when attacks on convoys on their way to the Soviet Union began in 1941, but this was not a benefit that they were sort of designed for. They didn't capture them to then attack these convoys that they didn't even know would exist later in the war. In terms of casualties, the failed defense of Norway would be costly for all of the Allied nations that were involved. The British would suffer about 2,000 casualties on land and around 2,500 at sea, with the French and Polish forces suffering about 530 combined. Around 850 Norwegian soldiers were killed, along with 400 civilians. The exact number of wounded Norwegians is a bit harder to determine due to the German occupation that would follow and the related difficulties in record keeping. Against these casualties, the Germans lost about 4,000 men, with the majority of those coming among the Kriegsmarine due to the number of ships that were damaged or destroyed. About 1,300 were killed in the land campaign. Looking ahead at the Allied war effort, the loss of Norway was really just one of many losses that would occur during the summer of 1940. France and Norway were of course lost to German occupation, but also the entry of Italy into the war would cause severe problems for the British war effort going forward. Looking back, some of the mistakes on the Allied side, and particularly the British side of the decision-making, seem obvious. The first problem was actually around Allied planning in the lead-up to the German invasion, planning in which the Norwegians were not involved. The planned Allied invasion of Norway, that thing that they were going to do, well, during this planning, there were actions taken without a full consideration of the situation in which the British and French found themselves at the start of 1940. They were really just too optimistic that they would be able to pull German attention away from France, while not truly committing the forces required to really pose a threat of any real sort of size to the German forces anywhere actually important. The second problem would simply be the inability of British intelligence to learn anything of what the Germans might be doing. They did know that ships left German ports and had sailed into the North Sea, but until there were confirmed landings on Norwegian soil, the assumption among the leaders of the Royal Navy and other British leaders was that the Germans were simply trying to break out into the Atlantic. If their purpose had been ascertained earlier, the actions of all of the Allied forces may have been drastically different. The third major problem is that once the German intentions were clear, the Allies refused to commit the forces necessary to truly meet the German challenge. There was a hesitancy to move troops and aircraft out of Britain and France, and this resulted in a situation where there was a lot of risk being placed on the troops that were on the ground in Norway, along with the Royal Navy when they were trying to support them, without there being enough troops to actually make a path to victory. These were the major problems. There were numerous other smaller problems at a tactical level, particularly around amphibious operations and the failure to properly appreciate the dominance that German air superiority would provide, and how much air power would be required to prevent that dominance from causing defeat on the ground. For the Norwegian government and military, the campaign had been a complete disaster, but it's hard to see what they could have done differently. They were almost entirely kind of at the whims of the nations that were already at war. The easy thing to criticize is that they did not join the Allies earlier, but it's hard to see how that would have improved things, given the fact that the British and French were going to attack them before the Germans were. The government in exile would find its reputation tainted by the fact that it had failed to stop Norway from being captured by the Germans, and really that it had failed to keep Norway out of the war altogether. But they were helped by the totally incompetent measures taken by the Germans to try and set up some kind of new Norwegian government to replace it. This government of collaboration, with Quisling at its head, held no legitimacy in any way, but was put in place by the Germans and was under the leadership of Quisling, who was a known collaborator, so no Norwegians were fooled. One of the major challenges is that local government was almost entirely free of German influence, and there would have to be attempts to kind of trickle down the central control through new local elections. The Quisling-led government would completely squander what was generally a relative period of calm throughout most of 1940, though. During those months, the largest portion of Norwegian people, the businesses that they led and worked at, and the local leaders just kind of went along with the new government because they weren't really pushing Nazification very hard. They weren't really, doing anything that was seen as greatly objectionable. And because they weren't doing those things, sort of resistance from local Norwegians, the normal Norwegians, was quite low. However, during the late summer of 1940, the Norwegian Supreme Court would resign under pressure from the Quisling government to give it more power and legitimacy. This began a very quick slide towards an active resistance from the Norwegian people, which would only strengthen over the following 5 years of occupation. As would so often be the case, the resistance took two different forms. There was the violent kind of resistance, but almost more importantly, there was the non-violent resistance from many different angles. For example, around Norway, the teachers in schools would be a focal point of resistance in early 1942, when they refused to conform with the new teaching standards that were set forth by the Quisling government, which pulled very heavily from the Hitler Youth, and would in fact make a new United National Youth Organization modeled directly after the German equivalent. Of the 14,000 teachers in Norway, 12,000 of them would join in active protests against the new teaching guidelines, and when they were threatened with dismissal, almost none of them gave in. 500 teachers would eventually be sent to a hard labor camp in northern Norway until they agreed to give up the protest, which they only did in August when the weather was about to make their situation completely untenable. But this act of resistance would actually have its intended effect, and the guidelines for the new National Youth Organization would be changed, with the government retreating to the idea that it was never meant to be a political organization, which was a clear statement of victory for the protesters. This type of grassroots resistance, from what were really, ordinary Norwegians, was in my mind the bravest type of resistance. These weren't fighters, they weren't soldiers, or even people trying to do violence. They were just people trying to resist the new Nazi-led government, and the only way that they could, even at great personal risk, to try and shield younger generations of Norwegians from what was happening. There were certainly flashier ways to resist, and in Norway there would be plenty of daring sabotage and clandestine violence, but the passive and active resistance from those within occupied Norway that was, not of a violent kind, in my mind, is the stuff that heroes are made of. But this would come at a cost, and over the course of the war, somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 Norwegians would be arrested for political reasons. Over 1,300 Norwegians would die in concentration camps, and the Norwegian Resistance Organization would lose over 2,000. The legacy of this violence, death, and suffering would live on for generations of Norwegians, and would cause a fundamental shift in the viewpoint of Norway as a nation. It would be one of the charter members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, forsaking the neutrality that it had clung to during the early decades of its existence. That neutrality had betrayed it in 1940, for a whole host of reasons. But over the following 5 years, Norway would be a critical contributor to final Allied victory. One important way in which this was done right from the beginning was through the use of almost 4.8 million tons of Norwegian shipping that was made available to Britain, helping it through the worst times of the war and bridging the gap to the American assistance that would begin arriving in 1942. Norway was not the first nation captured by the Nazis, and certainly would not be the last, but it would stand in concert with its allies for the rest of the war and join them in the celebrations of victory.